Okay, I'm joined on the line now by Mick Fealty, who's the editor of the political website Slugger O'Toole, which specialises in Irish politics. We've just heard, Mick, in the last hour that MPs have voted to force the government to release its plan on a no-deal Brexit. Why would that be necessary?
Because, in a way, one of the faults in the whole design of trying to affect Brexit, the British government have been highly secretive about all of their arrangements, not simply around no deal, but the whole way through. And Boris Johnson has sharpened that, if you like, by really shouting at Parliament saying, give me a general election, without ever really explaining what his threat of a no deal actually means. And of course, these are parliamentarians who aren't simply beholden for their seats to the referendum result. Each one of them has to be responsible to a constituency. And I think this is a marked victory for them and possibly one of a series of victories to come over the next week or two.
It hasn't mattered who's been Prime Minister, Theresa May or Boris Johnson. It seems Westminster just can't find a solution to the backstop, the issue of what to do about an Irish border. Why is it proving so difficult?
Well, because, in a way, it comes back to that famous quote from Boris Johnson himself during the referendum campaign, that to a certain extent, the backstop is an invention to facilitate Mrs May's rather peculiar deal that wanted to stay effectively within the single market, wanted to kind of operate through a kind of a quasi customs union, and wanted to keep in the whole of the economy on the island of Ireland those parts that are integrated, and not all of it is. Things like the electricity market is certainly runs across the border, but more particularly agriculture and farming, particularly dairy, is completely integrated. So the backstop was there to try and facilitate those trade operations to not be disaffected. The problem is that the criticism that Mrs May ran into in Parliament was that this wasn't allowing Brexit, as many of the extreme Brexiteers define it, to actually take place. So it's a circle that both she and subsequently Boris Johnson have struggled to square.
If we look back at Theresa May when she was in power, she called a snap election. Didn't turn out too well, the government losing its majority. Should Boris Johnson be so confident about wanting to go to a general election?
Well, I think the real issue is voter volatility here, because in the run-in to the 2017 election, Mrs May was on 45 or 46%. Mr Corbyn, the Labour leader, was on something like 23 or 24%, not that far away from where he is at the moment. And Boris Johnson is a great deal further away from where Mrs May was. Voter volatility is getting more and more difficult to anticipate. I don't think he's guaranteed getting a majority. I'm not even sure that he's guaranteed that we won't end up exactly back where we are. And I think the opposition, the British opposition anyway, is beginning to try and hedge its bets somehow and try and bring forward the whole issue of Brexit and deal with it before even thinking about going to a general election. And in terms of Ireland, I think Irish politicians, both within the government and in the opposition, are highly aware that the previous deal that they signed with the British was unable to get through that Parliament, and are hopeful that at least by the end of October, at least the direction or trajectory of any future deal may become more obvious at that stage.
It seems, Mick, like Boris Johnson is almost painted into a corner at this stage. We're hearing speculation of what he might do. But in reality, he said he's not going to ask for an extension to the deadline for Brexit from the EU. Yet his own Parliament has said that there isn't to be a no-deal Brexit on October 31st. What can he do in 5 weeks while Parliament's suspended?
I think that the only thing he can try to do is to accept reality, to try and go upstream and try and create some kind of conditions whereby he pushes the opposition parties into a situation where he asks them to be responsible and come up with some kind of hashed compromise and try and get that to go through. He isn't going to be able to do it by October. The fisheries bill is gone. That means that if we were to crash out in October, then Britain's fishermen would effectively have no legal structure to protect their rights. The farming bill is going the same way. It remains to be seen whether parliamentary business is wrapped up tonight, or whether it kind of creaks on for another few days to try and tidy up some of those issues. But I think it's almost a given that he's in no position to go for this crash-out deal, this no deal, simply because government simply hasn't got its business, the business that it needs to get done before the deadline date that he's arbitrarily set.
What possible concessions can Boris Johnson get from the EU? Would the EU give any ground anyway? I mean, they must be surely watching on from afar and rubbing their hands with glee at this entire shambles they're witnessing. Why would they give any further ground? Isn't it going their way?
I think it's tempting to look at it that way, but I think in many ways one of the issues with Brexit is there have been too many egos getting in the way of developing a properly negotiated deal. And I think that applies to both sides. It certainly applies to the lack of bilateral conversations that have been going on between London and Dublin in particular. I don't think anybody in Brussels is gleeful at this, but I also think that Brussels has probably taken more stock of the potential damage and figures that it will be damaged less by a crash out. I think it's becoming, as Parliament begins to take control, and it now has, this is a minority government that doesn't have a working majority, is well short of it, with or without the help of Northern Ireland's DUP, Leave Unionist Party. I think in a way, despite all the, for me, idle speculation within the press, this thing is going to run and run and run until Parliament, as a body, grabs it by the scruff of the neck and actually tries to deliver something, because I really don't think the government can do in this situation. But Parliament will not let the government that's brought us to this pass off scot-free and give them a free pass for an election.